Hello, welcome to the Sleepy Brain Science, the channel where we explore the remarkable story of humanity, one slow, restful breath at a time. Tonight, we travel somewhere far beyond memory, beyond language, beyond cities, beyond any calendar ever scratched into stone. We go back to the very first chapter of the human story, to a time when our ancestors were just beginning to figure out what it meant to be alive in a vast, dangerous, astonishing world. They stood beneath skies thick with stars they couldn't name. They crossed coastlines that no longer exist. They stood face to face with other kinds of humans, beings now gone from the earth. And somehow, through fire and ice and generations of quiet endurance, they survived. They found a way through. And here's the thing that still stops scientists in their tracks. This is not a story about strangers. The deeper we look, the more familiar they become. In their footsteps we find the origins of language, of loyalty, of grief, of art, of curiosity. In their choices are the first seeds of everything we now call civilization. If these slow, wandering journeys bring you peace, if this channel is part of how you wind down, I'd love it for you to like, subscribe, or drop a thought in the comments. It helps other tired minds find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let the busy part of your mind grow quiet. We're going back to the very beginning. The oldest fossils we've identified as Homo sapiens, our species, come from a site in Jebel Irhoud, Morocco. They're roughly 300,000 years old. But what's fascinating from a neuroscience perspective is that these early humans weren't quite like us in every way. Their brain cases, the rounded dome of the skull that houses the brain, were flatter and more elongated than ours. The face was already strikingly modern. But the globular, high-domed skull we have today came later, suggesting our brains didn't just grow larger over time, they changed shape, they reorganized. Africa at that time was a living mosaic, shifting between lush grasslands, deep lakes, and expanding deserts. Populations could grow, become isolated, adapt to local conditions, and then reconnect with other groups tens of thousands of years later. This braided history is part of why our genetic diversity is so rich. Every person alive today carries DNA that traces back to those African populations. When you look far enough back, all human family trees merge into one. Geneticists have a concept called the most recent common ancestor, the single individual from whom mathematically every living human descends. What's counterintuitive is how recent this person probably was. Models suggest this individual may have lived only a few thousand years ago, not hundreds of thousands. That's because ancestry spreads exponentially. One person's descendants radiate outward through generations, overlapping with everyone else's. Think of your genome as a museum built from thousands of anonymous donors. Every section of your DNA was shaped by a different ancestor adapting to a different place and time, a body dealing with altitude, disease, drought, cold, famine. That museum is in every cell you have.
At some point, most likely between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, a relatively small group of Homo sapiens crossed into what is now the Middle East, then fanned outward across Eurasia. And small is the key word here. When a small population breaks away from a larger one, it carries only a fraction of the original genetic variation. This is called the founder effect, and it explains something remarkable. People living outside of Africa today are, genetically, less diverse than populations that stayed. The rest of the world was populated by a kind of genetic subset of Africa. But that subset was still astonishingly adaptable. Those small groups followed coastlines, traced river valleys, navigated mountain passes. They met storms and predators and climates completely unlike anything their ancestors had known. And they kept moving. Eventually, they reached every habitable corner of the earth. For decades, we imagined Neanderthals as our ancient competitors, eventually outcompeted and replaced by our smarter, more modern ancestors. The actual story, written in DNA, is more human than that. When modern Homo sapiens moved into Europe and Western Asia, they encountered Neanderthals who had been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. They met. They likely traded, they shared fire and perhaps shelter, and they had children together. We know this because most people alive today who descend from non-African populations carry somewhere between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some of those inherited variants appear in genes related to immune function, possibly giving early modern humans a leg up against pathogens they'd never encountered before. Other Neanderthal variants are associated with modern conditions like certain allergies or metabolic tendencies, a reminder that genes suited to one environment aren't always suited to another. What this really tells us is something quietly profound. Our species did not march through prehistory alone, sweeping everything else aside. We moved through a neighborhood. We sat by fires with people who were different from us, and sometimes we chose each other. This is the one that tends to make even seasoned researchers pause. When the first people arrived in what we now call Australia, then connected to New Guinea as a single landmass called Sahul, sea levels were lower than today. But even so, reaching it required crossing open water multiple times, deliberately. This means those early people built watercraft capable of open sea travel. They read currents and wind. They navigated island chains through what is now Indonesia, some of those channels miles wide with no visible land on the other side. They took their families into the unknown with enough confidence to keep going. This is not accident. This is planning and courage and skill. It places seafaring, ocean navigation deep in the prehistoric record, tens of thousands of years before anything like writing or metal tools existed. The ocean wasn't a wall, it was a road. It's easy to assume tools appeared when we did, but the archaeological record tells a different story. The earliest stone tools we've found, called Oldowan tools, simple but deliberately shaped flakes and choppers, are over 2.5 million years old. Our species is only 300,000 years old. Something else made those first tools. Early members of the genus Homo, like Homo habilis, were already selecting specific rock types, striking them at calculated angles and producing consistent, usable edges.
Later came the Acheulean tradition, the elegant teardrop-shaped hand axes associated with Homo erectus, which persisted almost unchanged for over 1 million years. What's interesting from a neuroscience standpoint is what tool use did to the body. When external tools begin doing the heavy mechanical work of cutting and grinding, the biological pressure to maintain massive jaws and teeth is reduced. Over many generations, faces became lighter, more delicate. Culture literally reshaped anatomy. We didn't invent stone tools, we inherited them, and they changed us in return. Controlled fire appears in the archaeological record at least 400,000 years ago, though some evidence pushes it further, and its effects on human biology were profound. Cooking softens and pre-digests food, dramatically increasing the caloric yield from plants and meat. Because the brain is one of the most metabolically expensive organs in the body, consuming roughly 20% of our total energy at rest, anything that reliably increases caloric intake can support larger, more complex brains over evolutionary time. But fire did something beyond nutrition. It extended the usable day. Before fire, night brought predators and cold and a kind of forced stillness. With fire, groups could stay awake safely for hours after dark. They could work, they could talk, skills could be demonstrated and corrected and passed on in the warmth of a shared flame. In that sense, the campfire wasn't just heating food, it was running a school. The evidence for early clothing is subtle but persuasive. Bone needles, thin, precisely shaped, with drilled eyes, appear in the archaeological record around 50,000 years ago. Scrapers for preparing hides are much older, and there's a strange biological clue hiding in human lice. Body lice, which need fabric to survive in, appear to have diverged from head lice only after humans began wearing clothes regularly. Fitted garments, not just draped skins, trap body heat far more effectively. They made it possible for small, relatively hairless mammals to survive Ice Age Europe and the vast cold plains of northern Asia. They protected infants and elders who couldn't withstand exposure. They turned hostile climates into livable ones. Clothing was not decoration first, it was an engineering solution, stitched together from patience and necessity, that unlocked half the planet. When you look at the Tave paintings of Chauvet or Altamira or Lascaux, what strikes you isn't their antiquity, it's their sophistication. Artists used charcoal and ochre to suggest volume and motion. They positioned animals to use the natural curves of rock, giving their subjects a three-dimensional quality. They returned to the same walls over generations, layering meaning onto meaning. And then there are the hand stencils. A hand pressed to stone, pigment blown around it, and suddenly, 40,000 years later, you are looking at a specific person. That choice to mark their presence in the world feels deeply human. Similar art has been found across Europe, Southeast Asia, and beyond, which tells us this wasn't a local curiosity. Symbolic thinking traveled with people. Wherever they went, they made beauty. They left records. Even in cold and hunger and danger, they made time for meaning. Our closest primate relatives use all four limbs. Becoming bipedal, walking consistently on two legs was one of the earliest and most dramatic experiments in hominin evolution, and it didn't wait for big brains. Upright walking frees the hands. It allows a small-bodied hominin to carry food, tools, and infants across long distances. It changes the visual horizon, eyes scanning high across open grassland rather than down at the ground. It makes sustained long-distance travel possible in a way that knuckle walking does not. But it comes at a cost. The human spine, pelvis, and knee are all essentially compromised designs, optimized for walking but still carrying the legacy of an ancestor that moved very differently. Back pain, difficult childbirth, fallen arches, these are the receipts from a several million-year renovation project that isn't quite finished. In 1978, at a site called Laetoli in Tanzania, Mary Leakey's team made a discovery that still feels almost impossible. A volcanic eruption had dusted the ground with ash, rain turned it to a thin paste, and then a small group of Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as the famous Lucy, walked across it. The ash hardened, the footprints were buried, and 3.6 million years later they were uncovered. What researchers found was eerily in its familiarity. A heel strike, a longitudinal arch, a big toe pointed forward, not splayed sideways like an ape's grasping foot, a fully upright human-like stride preserved in ancient stone. Some researchers noticed the footprints seemed to show two individuals walking very close together, perhaps side by side. We'll never know why, but they crossed that surface and they kept going. And we followed them.
Stone survives millions of years. Bone sometimes lasts, but wood, the material that almost certainly made up the majority of early human technology, almost always returns to the earth within years of being discarded. Early humans almost certainly made digging sticks, throwing clubs, bowls, carrying frames, traps, and shelter structures from wood. Fire could harden wooden points. Stone scrapers could smooth and shape branches. The oldest known wooden spears, found in Germany and dated to around 400,000 years ago, are startling precisely because they're rare. They survived only because of unusually oxygen-poor soil. The archaeological record of early human life is missing most of its pages. What we call the Stone Age was not a world of stone alone. It was a world of organic materials, plant fibers, bark, hide, reed, almost all of which has disappeared. What we're reading is the skeleton of a story whose soft tissue is gone. When the fossil, nicknamed Lucy, was discovered in Ethiopia in 1974, she gave scientists a window into a much older chapter of the human story. She belonged to Australopithecus afarensis, a species that lived roughly 3.2 million years ago, far earlier than Homo sapiens. Her skeleton reveals a remarkable mix. Her pelvis and leg bones are adapted for upright walking. Her arms and shoulders suggest she was also comfortable in trees. She moved through a world of predators and shrinking forests on two legs, but hadn't yet given up the canopy entirely. Lucy also reminds us that evolution is not a ladder climbing steadily toward us. It's a branching landscape, a bush, not a tree, with many different experiments running simultaneously.
Her species was not an unfinished version of something greater. They were complete, successful creatures, shaped by their own time and place. Look at the skull of an early Homo species, then look at our own. One of the most consistent changes across that long arc is a reduction in the size of the face, jaw, and teeth. And the story behind that change involves both technology and culture. When sharp stone flakes began doing the cutting and scraping that large jaws once had to handle, and when cooking softened food before it ever reached the mouth, the evolutionary pressure to maintain heavy dental equipment began to ease. Over many generations, lighter, smaller faces became viable. A chin, unique to Homo sapiens among all primates, began to appear. Culture shaped biology. A tool in the hand, used across enough generations, eventually appeared in the bones of the face. No ancient word survives. No voice recording echoes from any cave. But bodies carry indirect evidence of speech. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped structure that anchors the muscles of the tongue and throat, appears in fossils of Neanderthals in a form nearly identical to our own, suggesting similar vocal capabilities. The FOPX2 gene, associated with the fine motor control needed for speech, shows signs of selection in both modern humans and Neanderthals. And the demands of complex tool-making, long-range cooperation, and coordinated hunting all push toward the need for detailed symbolic communication. Language is a technology that lives outside the body. Once you can say the word for danger rather than waiting to demonstrate it, culture can move faster than genes. Once you can describe tomorrow, you can plan for it. Once you can tell a child how to make a tool without placing their hands in danger, knowledge accumulates across generations. Language didn't just describe the world, it began to build a new one. Teeth are built in layers like rings in a tree, and because they form early in life and then largely stop changing, they preserve a biochemical record of early experience that bone and tissue cannot. Periods of serious illness or nutritional stress during childhood leave visible lines in teeth enamel called hypoplastic defects, a physical record of a difficult season. Microscopic wear on the chewing surface reveals diet, gritty plant material, tough uncooked meat, or the smoother wear pattern associated with cooked food. Isotopes locked into tooth enamel during formation carry chemical signatures of local geology and water, allowing researchers to determine where in the landscape a person grew up, even if they died far from home. A single tooth sitting in a museum tray can tell you the weaning age of an infant, the hunger seasons of a childhood, the diet of an adult, and the region where that person was born. It is not a fragment, it is a biography.